John McCarthy examines the ancient history of Jerusalem on It Ain't Necessarily So in an hour's time. First on Meridian, The South Bank Show.
Chapter 1. A long-expected party. When Mr. Bilbo Baggins of Bag End announced that he would shortly be celebrating his 11th birthday with a party of special magnificence, there was much talk and excitement in Hobbiton. Bilbo was very rich and very peculiar, and had been the wonder of the Shire for 60 years, ever since his remarkable disappearance and unexpected return. The riches he had brought back from his travels had now become a local legend, and it was popularly believed, whatever the old folk might say, that the hill at Bag End was full of tunnels stuffed with treasure.
And so began John Ronald Reuel Tolkien's celebrated epic, first published in 1954. The Lord of the Rings is one of the best-selling novels of all time, and continues to get voted most popular book by readers' polls. Now, in probably the biggest and most ambitious filmmaking venture ever, the director Peter Jackson has shot 3 films simultaneously, based upon the 3 installments of Tolkien's mythical adventure. In Aurora Gunn's South Bank Show, we talked to Peter Jackson about how he realised Tolkien's fully imagined universe, and discussed the difficulties of bringing this work to the screen. While Tolkien's book has inspired artists, musicians, as well as a whole new generation of fantasy writers, to some, The Lord of the Rings is something of a literary curiosity. However, in a genre which some say Tolkien invented, his imaginative masterwork remains both unchallenged and alone.
You get a very vivid sense of what this should look like by reading the book. I mean, that was one of Tolkien's great strengths, was it reads like you're watching a movie. His description of landscape, of weather, of characters, of journeys, of how they feel, their tiredness, their hunger, it's so vivid. And the battle scenes, you know, everything makes you feel like you're there. And so he, in a funny kind of a way, he had a very cinematic approach to his writing.
Is it secret? Is it safe?
What are you doing?
I don't need to go and see the movie. I have seen the movie. The movie played in my head, privately, just for me. I read Lord of the Rings when I was 13. I read it in 23 hours. What I particularly remember was that I was babysitting for some friends of my parents that evening. And as I was reading, it became quite cinematographic. I can just about recall the click of the central heating going off, and the room getting colder, and the forest began at the edge of the carpet. I was actually almost physically transported into the world.
The hobbits now left the tunnel gate and rode across the wide hollow. On the far side was a faint path leading up onto the floor of the forest, 100 yards and more beyond the hedge, but it vanished as soon as it brought them under the trees. Looking back, they could see the dark line of the hedge through the stems of trees that were already thick about them. Looking ahead, they could see only tree trunks of innumerable sizes and shapes, straight or bent, twisted, leaning, squat or slender, smooth or gnarled and branched, and all the stems were green or grey with moss and slimy, shaggy growths.
Tolkien has never gone through that critical process. No critic made Tolkien. For years and years, in fact, long before the media was aware that he existed, hundreds, thousands, millions of readers knew about the Lord of the Rings, and it was a word of mouth thing. I think if you went to university in the early 70s, I've heard that, you know, you were actually forced at gunpoint before you were actually allowed into the college to read Lord of the Rings. It was one of the things you did, you know. Not smoke dope, read Lord of the Rings.
In films, well, there's been vast genres of them. But it's extraordinary because it did all spring from this one book, and none of these things were around before 1954, 1955, when it first emerged. There was nothing like this. There were no Dungeons and Dragons, there was no sword and sorcery, there were no computer games of that sort. There were very few books which had anything like that kind of mixture and appeal. So it was completely fresh.
When you read the book, you get a very strong impression that the language was really Tolkien's first love, and I think he possibly said that in an interview at some stage, that really the Lord of the Rings was an opportunity for him to present his love of language in the form of a story, in a sort of a more mass appeal kind of a way, rather than just a textbook on the Elvish language. He was able to create a story with elves and use their language as almost like the fabric of the book.
There are markings. It's some form of Elvish. I can't read it.
There are few who can. The language is that of Mordor, which I will not utter here.
Mordor?
In the common tongue, it says, one ring to rule them all. One ring to find them. One ring to bring them all. And in the darkness, bind them.
The invention of languages is the foundation. The stories were made rather to provide a world for the languages than the reverse. To me, a name comes first and the story follows. I should have preferred to write in Elvish, but of course, such a work as The Lord of the Rings has been edited and only as much language has been left in as I thought would be stomached by readers. I now find that many would have liked more. But there is a great deal of linguistic matter other than actually Elvish names and words included or mythologically expressed in the book. It is, to me anyway, largely an essay in linguistic aesthetic. As I sometimes say to people who ask me, what is it all about?
Tolkien had always had a passion for language. He'd studied and later taught English at Oxford. Privately, he spent much of his time creating new languages, based upon the ancient tongues of countries such as Wales and Finland. He decided to put them to good use by writing a book of English myths, which he'd conjured up from his imagination. He called it The Silmarillion.
He never intended to write The Lord of the Rings at all. What he intended to do was to write The Silmarillion, which he began in about 1917 when he was still involved in the First World War, and this was simply an outlet for his huge imagination, which had been stimulated by philology, by studying Germanic languages, by studying Norse sagas, by studying Anglo-Saxon poetry. And that drove him not just to be a scholarly investigator of it, but to be a creator in the same genre.
Tolkien was cross about England's mythology because when he was in his teens he got drunk upon three great national bodies of literature: the Elder Edda from Iceland, the Kalevala, which is the Finnish pagan epic, and Beowulf, the Anglo-Saxon poem. And what he wanted was a bigger Beowulf. He wanted a huge national cycle based on Anglo-Saxon models, full of wolves and orcs and trolls and forests and mountains, to match the kind of stuff that Iceland and Finland provided. And England didn't, because it got civilized too quickly. Along came the Normans, along came the Vikings, along came the High Middle Ages, and bang, whiz, we're an extremely sophisticated Christian country, not producing the kind of goods Tolkien wanted.
He was a strange man. When he used to talk about the war, you would assume he was talking about the Second World War. I would anyway. But no, it was the Norman conquest that he was talking about, because he felt that England had been in decline ever since the Normans arrived. You know.
And he wrote the Silmarillion in various drafts and forms in the 1920s, and I think by the 30s he'd stopped, and then he wrote The Hobbit as one of a whole bunch of children's books he was writing for his own children. He abandoned it unfinished, and it was only finished because a publisher discovered about it, and I think C.S. Lewis encouraged him as well to finish it.
A sequel or successor to The Hobbit is called for. I promise to give this thought and attention. Mr. Baggins began as a comic tale among conventional and inconsistent Grimm's fairy tale dwarves and got drawn into the edge of it, so that even Sauron the Terrible peeped over the edge. And what more can hobbits do? They can be comic, but their comedy is suburban, unless it is set against things more elemental.
Despite his misgivings, his publishers were in luck. Tolkien did decide to embark upon a sequel.
He sat down and began to write the first page of The Lord of the Rings without any planning at all. There was no scheme, no synopsis. I mean, I've been through all those first drafts, those papers, which all still survive. And it's perfectly clear that he was flying blind. He never intended it to be what it was. It only gradually shaped itself as he wrote it. At the beginning of The Lord of the Rings, Frodo Baggins, who's a hobbit, has inherited a magic ring from his uncle Bilbo, who acquired it in the previous book, The Hobbit. And he gradually discovers that his mission is to carry this ring across Middle-earth, across the landscape of Tolkien's invented world, and hurl it to its destruction in the cracks of doom. Otherwise, it will get into the wrong hands and will essentially destroy the world.
Tolkien's story begins in the Shire, which is modelled on the countryside of his childhood in the West Midlands. The Shire is inhabited by the hobbits and is part of a fictional land called Middle-earth.
There's a sort of a belief by people that haven't read The Lord of the Rings that it is set on another planet, that Middle-earth is sort of some other place. But Tolkien was creating a mythic prehistory of our own world, that he imagined The Lord of the Rings to be set on Earth about 6,000 or 7,000 years ago, and at a time when all records have been lost now. And he was very much writing a story for England, because he was mourning the fact that England's mythology had been wiped out. Its oral stories had been wiped out with the Norman invasion of 1066, and that he wanted to somehow replace this void.
The biggest character in Lord of the Rings was Middle-earth itself. When I remember it now, I remember it as figures in the landscape, small figures in the landscape. The mountains were more real than the people, which isn't to say the people were particularly unreal, but somehow he was a great geography writer. He really was. And you remember the forests, and you remember the river, and you... I remember opening the book, and there was a map. And I'd only ever seen a map in a book once before, and that was in Treasure Island. You open the map, and it's big, and there's all these different things, and genuinely a new horizon opens.
All at once, as if through a gate of light, the road ran out again from the end of the tunnel into the open. There at the bottom of a sharp incline, they saw before them a long, flat mile, and beyond that, the ford of Rivendell. On the further side was a steep brown bank threaded by a winding path, and behind that the tall mountains climbed, shoulder above shoulder, and peak beyond peak into the fading sky.
The landscape of The Lord of the Rings, and indeed The Hobbit, is very carefully planned. It may seem a wonderful stroke of the imagination, particularly as he wasn't a traveller. He actually travelled abroad very little in his life. But he planned it from the point of view of the story. It starts in the safe territory of the Shire. There's then this wall of mountains you've got to get through to the other side. When you get to the other side, things get nastier and more dangerous. And finally you get to Mordor, the seat of evil, and things are very bad indeed. Trees are enormously important in his mythology, all through his not merely Lord of the Rings writings, but the shorter books. There are titles and short stories and references to trees. When he finally created the Ents, which are walking trees, human trees, he kind of reached the peak of his imagination.
Jung said that trees are the thoughts of God, and I think that they are certainly the architecture of the planet, and they are absolutely central to all the great northern myths. All the northern myths are about forest, really, because the forest initially was a place of fear, because that's where the wild animals were, and then the cutting down of the forest was the civilizing thing. But it also was destroying the magic. The destruction of the forest is the destruction of magic, and magic resides in the forest, not in individual trees, but in the notion of forest.
When you're faced with adapting the 1,200 pages of The Lord of the Rings, it's obviously an incredibly daunting task. It's daunting in several ways. One, just as a book, it's very dense, and there's a lot of characters, and It has levels of depth, layers that you can scrape away one layer and there's more information below, and you can scrape that away and there's more information, which is exactly what makes it such a wonderfully beloved book. To somehow translate that into film, it's virtually impossible, that particular aspect of the book. What you can do is you can take the story, you can take the characters, and you can make a movie that has the moments that presents on film, the moments that people remember from the book.
Today is my 111th birthday.
It presents the characters that people love, and we obviously try very hard to present the themes that were important to Tolkien in the book. But there's no way ever that a movie could come close to capturing the sort of level of detail and complexity.
John Boorman was invited to turn The Lord of the Rings into a live-action film 30 years ago. He spent a year developing a screenplay until the film company decided it wasn't commercially viable.
You used to get the giggles about some of the issues. There's one I remember clearly when Gandalf is vanquished. He said the text is he fell beyond time and memory. And we, puzzled about how you put that on film.
Tolkien did a lot of things in his story that if you were a filmmaker, you would choose not to do. It's as simple as that. I mean, his villains are very difficult to put into film. I mean, Sauron, his ultimate evil in the story of The Lord of the Rings, is unable to take physical form by the time the events of The Lord of the Rings take place, and he manifests himself as a giant flaming eyeball. Now, to have a movie in which your principal villain is a flaming eyeball is not a decision that you would make if you were writing an original screenplay.
Gandalf, one of the story's main protagonists, is a wizard who guides the hobbits and the other members of the Fellowship on their quest to destroy the ring.
I based Gandalf's voice on Tolkien's own voice. I'd heard him reading extracts from the books.
Nothing to read, so I scribbled on it. I can't think why. In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit.
So it was rather easy to roughen up the voice slightly, all that pipe tobacco that had gone down there, and English gentlemen. I kept thinking of Oxfordshire and the rolling hills of the Midlands, and it's quite cool. What can you see? Can you see anything?
Nothing. There's nothing.
One of Gandalf's most formidable enemies is fellow wizard Saruman, who also conspires to take the ring.
Saruman, at some stage, the lust for power, breeds this overweening arrogance.
Already his troops are on the move. The Nine.
He believes that he can become the Lord of the Rings, that he is more powerful than Sauron himself. And that is his downfall. Saruman is very definitely the most brilliant, the most powerful, with the greatest intellect and the greatest knowledge. Gandalf himself says that. So really, Saruman is the dark side of Gandalf. And he is the evil immortal. And that becomes quite obvious.
One of the great inventions of the piece is that he is actually the shadow side of Gandalf. That you have this ultimate magical good and evil which are enshrined in the same person. And that's a tremendous observation that he makes, and I think it's one of the things that has a great resonance.
He came and laid his long hand on my arm. "And why not, Gandalf?" he whispered. "Why not the ruling ring? If we could command that, then the power would pass to us. That is in truth why I brought you here, for I have many eyes in my service, and I believe that you know where this precious thing now lies. Is it not so? Or why do the Nine ask for the Shire, and what is your business there?" As he said this, a lust which he could not conceal shone suddenly in his eyes.
One of his strengths is that he's very good at portraying evil. Most writers in this sort of genre produce cardboard villains. Tolkien's brilliant at getting the hairs prickling on the back of your neck. I mean, the Balrog in The Lord of the Rings, when they go under the mountains, under the misty mountains, and trying to get through to the other side. And they have these dreadful adventures, which the atmosphere builds up incredibly heavily and dramatically. And finally, Gandalf has this conflict with this nameless, well, not nameless, but this absolutely undescribed creature of darkness.
The Balrog made no answer. The fire in it seemed to die, but the darkness grew. It stepped forward slowly onto the bridge, and suddenly it drew itself up to a great height, and its wings were spread from wall to wall. But still Gandalf could be seen, glimmering in the gloom. He seemed small, and altogether alone, grey and bent, like a wizened tree before the onset of a storm. From out of the shadow a red sword leaped, flaming. Glamdring glittered white in answer. There was a ringing clash and a stab of white fire. The Balrog fell back, and its sword flew up in molten fragments. The wizard swayed on the bridge, stepped back a pace, and then again stood still. "You cannot pass," he said. With a bound, the Balrog leaped full upon the bridge. Its whip whirled and hissed.
Often we had to work in front of blue screen, which means that the scenery will be added later. The monster will be added later. I fought the Balrog, the great Balrog, who was nothing more than a yellow tennis ball on top of a stand, and I had to pretend that was the Balrog. I still don't know what the Balrog looks like, and I fought him months back now.
Tolkien's themes that were important to him, we've tried to translate as best we can into the movie. He was writing very much about the conflict between the natural world and the world of the machine. In a way, it's a very melancholy story of a changing world which reflects England in the pre-industrial age that is changed forever and will never be the same again because of the arrival of the machine. And in a sense, the ring represents the machine and the power of the ring, that once this enters the world, people are bound to it.
The destruction of Germany, be it 100 times merited, is one of the most appalling world catastrophes. While the first war of the machines seems to be drawing to its final inconclusive chapter, leaving, alas, everyone the poorer, many bereaved or maimed, and millions dead, and only one thing triumphant: the machines. As the servants of the machines are becoming a privileged class, the machines are going to be enormously more powerful.
What is particularly different about Tolkien is that it's a modern story, and it embodies some of the greatest modern fears. And the most central modern fear is a combination of industrialization, lethally effective warfare, and destructive technology that's going to destroy the human spirit, destroy human freedom, and destroy the natural environment, all as one package.
He wasn't setting out to write allegories about anything at all, but I mean, there's no question that among the things that fuel the energy of the whole structure is a concern with issues of war and peace, specifically war. And I think it's quite fair to treat The Lord of the Rings as an allegory of the 20th century.
I was always mindful that he was writing, imagining Lord of the Rings during the late 30s and 40s, when, of course, the world was fighting the ultimate evil, and that Sauron, the Lord of the Rings, was a sort of Hitler figure.
It's very much a product of his times, and but I do think that perhaps, although it may feel a bit dated today, I think it might well have a resonance to the current situation. You could say, the Dark Lord is Bin Laden.
Sauron's forces are already moving. They will find the rings. and kill the one who carries it.
Go! Frodo! Come on, Frodo!
He had a sort of utopian stroke dystopian view of the world because of his own early experiences. His father had died when he was just a very small child. And he'd been brought up in a series of villages and suburbs of Birmingham, which were more village than suburb in those days. And the Warwickshire countryside seemed to him gorgeous. But at one point, his mother could no longer afford to go living in it, and they moved into the city, into Birmingham. His mother had died when he was about 12. He'd been orphaned, therefore, into a really rather unkind world. He lived in lodging houses. He'd been brought up by a kindly but rather severe Roman Catholic monk. But, you know, his outlook was essentially that of there had once been a golden age, and I longed to get back into it, and this was his process of getting back into it. He was an explosive mixture. My mother was an undergraduate in Oxford in the 1930s and used to say that going to his lectures was risky because if you didn't sit in the front row, you wouldn't hear what he was saying because he talked so fast. But if you did sit in the front row, he'd spit all over you. There was so much energy. When he lectured on Beowulf, he would come into the room reciting the first lines of Beowulf as he arrived. What way are dinner in Yardagram? I can't remember the rest of it, but tremendously dramatic. And I think he was like that all the way through, that his approach to his academic work was absolutely indistinguishable from his approach to his creative work. It was just tremendous energy, tremendous conviction, total belief in the whole thing. He used to smoke a pipe while he talked. He would put it in his mouth and light it and, tamp down the tobacco and take it out again. And so there was a constant sort of theatrical business going on. He was, in a sense, a kind of caricature Oxford Don, but very charming, very warm. Didn't really kind of switch on to who I was or ask me questions about myself, but was very affable. But there was also the kind of slightly blimpish, slightly self-caricaturing Daily Telegraph reading, I don't like anything that isn't English attitude, which runs through his books, after all, because the Hobbits are very self-sufficient, very, very English.
Actually, it's funny to think, isn't it, of he and C.S. Lewis, sitting in Oxford, one writing, Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, and the other writing The Lord of the Rings, these two fuddy-duddy old dons, raging around in the world of myth.
He shut his eyes and struggled for a while. But resistance became unbearable, and at last he slowly drew out the chain and slipped the ring on the forefinger of his left hand. Immediately, though everything else remained as before, dim and dark, the shapes became terribly clear. He was able to see beneath their black wrappings. There were 5 tall figures, 2 standing on the lip of the dell, 3 advancing. In their white faces burned keen and merciless eyes. Under their mantles were long grey robes. Upon their grey hairs were helms of silver. In their haggard hands were swords of steel. Their eyes fell on him and pierced him as they rushed towards him.
The Hobbits are a representation, Tolkien did admit this much, of the small English, not small in physical stature, but kind of small in world outlook, small in experience, but how they can rise to the challenge of enormous anxiety and danger and come out on top.
You draw far too much attention to yourself, Mr. Underhill.
Tolkien's universe is a fairly limited one. There's lots about it I don't like. The bad guys are black, by and large, a lot of them, the orcs. The east is bad, the south is bad, the north is good, the west is where the good people go when they die or go on to and I don't like morality determined by geography in such an obvious way.
Take 1, go track.
People often put some sort of racist slur onto Tolkien, which I think is totally inappropriate. And in fact, the Fellowship of the Ring is all about the fact that different races must unite and work together to rid an evil of the world. So the idea that he is very sort of English and rather insular in his writings of the Hobbits and the way that he describes Bilbo's attitude in particular, I just find it incredibly charming and quaint. I mean, my father was like that, my grandparents. I mean, this is to me, it's a very familiar attitude of that time.
It does feel to me intensely English, the relationship between Frodo and the middle-class hobbit and Sam, his gardener. who go off to war together, is a class story in part, and their love and respect for each other is very touching, going across class barriers.
I have to leave the Shire. Sam and I must get debris.
Tolkien felt he was writing for a non-religious society, a world where there was no mythology, no religion, and he felt he could fuel that need, he could actually fill up the gap, and I think he did do that. It's on the edge of sometimes of the craziness of a sect. I mean, the most obsessive Tolkien lovers exclude everything else, every other form of literature, every other form of religion.
The Lord of the Rings is, of course, a fundamentally religious and Catholic work. Unconsciously so at first, but consciously in the revision. That is why I have not put in or have cut out practically all references to anything like religion, to cults or practices in the imaginary world. For the religious element is absorbed into the story and the symbolism. However, that is very clumsily put and sounds more self-important than I feel, for as a matter of fact, I have consciously planned very little, and should chiefly be grateful for having been brought up since I was 8 in a faith that has nourished me and taught me all the little that I know. And that I owe to my mother, who clung to her conversion and died young, largely through the hardships of poverty resulting from it.
Nobody worships anything. There are no temples and churches. And also it draws heavily on pagan mythology. But it's a Christian outlook in the sense that it's little people, it's the weak, the underrated, the marginal, who are actually the centre of attention and bring things about.
On his journey to Mordor, Frodo meets the saintly figure of Galadriel, Queen of the Elves.
I mean, there's very few female characters in The Lord of the Rings. She's a talisman, I think, in a lot of ways for Frodo. Galadriel is someone who has an edge of danger about her because she is a ring bearer, and that I suppose that she has the potential, if she was to take the One Ring, that she too could turn into the evil force that Sauron is.
So we'll just roll for 5 seconds.
I think it's unwise to go back and say, you know, it's a very bad book because there are practically no female characters with speaking roles and so. Yes, but that's how things were in those days. You may as well object to the fact that all the wizards smoked pipes, and we now know smoking is a very bad thing.
Tolkien never wanted for it to be made into a film, and he said so to me. The reason he sold the film rights was for the education of his grandchildren. It was as straightforward as that. And of course, the other thing is, Tolkien said to me, how did I propose to make it? Was it going to be an animation film or with actors? And I said it was going to be actors. So he was greatly relieved. He said, I have had this nightmare that it will be a cartoon. And of course, the irony was that United Artists then gave it to Ralph Bakshi, who made it into this appalling animation film. But Tolkien, of course, never lived to see it.
When I was 18 years old, I read the book for the first time because I saw the animated film, and I was intrigued and I was interested and I wanted to learn more, because obviously that particular film only got halfway through the story. And I think seeing it today, I think it was a very groundbreaking and brave film for its time. It's dated somewhat. I mean, because it's artwork and it's particularly stylized artwork, it has a very 1970s sort of feel to it. What I like about the computer technology that's available today is its seamlessness. So when you see a city that's created out of a computer, it looks like a real city, or a cave troll looks very real and lifelike. Our art department, they've taken a lot of care into making everything look old, and there's weeds and the cracks. Well, given Tolkien's suspicion and indeed sort of hatred of technology, it is ironic in a way that technology certainly was one of the motivations why we made the film. Our other primary motivation for The Lord of the Rings was to make it as real as possible, make it feel like history, don't make people feel like they're looking at anything that's artificial or false.
Stylistically, it seems, from what I've seen of the film, that Peter wanted the audience to feel that the camera had actually been there when these events took place, so that the audience, too, could believe them on that naturalistic level.
And you're going to fall to your right? Yeah, all is right. Sean will join us.
Filming it in New Zealand was really a decision that was based on a couple of things. I'm a New Zealand filmmaker and I live and work there, and I don't want to travel abroad either, just like the hobbits. I'm a very hobbity sort of character. And secondly, you know, from a more practical point of view, we're able to put our cameras on a hilltop and look 360 degrees and never see a road, never see a building, never see a power pole. And so from that point of view, we were able to tell a mythic prehistory of Europe shooting in an unspoiled European-type landscape.
We must turn back! No!
We were often on top of mountains, you know, dumped by a helicopter on virgin snow, walking where human beings had never walked before, in mountains that weren't charted until 50 years ago, that part of the high mountain ranges in the South Island of New Zealand.
This is the first time, I think, that anyone's ever shot 3 films simultaneously, back to back. And what that means is that we wrote 3 scripts that required 15 months of shooting to make all 3, and we just shot for 15 months and made all 3 films at the same time. And they're sitting there, the special effects work is just beginning on the 2nd film now, and then next year we'll be, you know, doing the 3rd film. Basically, they're all sitting there in the can.
Let's go.
Almost anything you can imagine you can do if you've got the money. I mean, but people are spending $20 million on computer effects in pictures, and probably Peter Jackson probably spent more than that. I would expect that the 3 pictures, the computer effects probably cost about $100 million.
Let us hope that our presence may go unnoticed. They are coming.
Lord of the Rings has inspired a lot of popular culture over the years, and in some respects it's been perverted. You know, in the 1970s, the Tolkien sword and sorcery sort of genre, well, it became sword and sorcery in the 70s, and then it got appropriated by the heavy metal culture and record albums and with this sort of graphic artwork, and it sort of took it in a direction that I think would have probably appalled Tolkien.
I think that it is perhaps part of our life now that people do adopt some aspect of popular culture and follow it, if not obsessively, but with shall we say, some keenness, and they do it for things like Star Trek, and they do it for football teams, and they do it for Tolkien.
Tolkien fan clubs began to spring up almost as soon as the book became well known. Not quite as when it was published in the 50s, but by the 60s they were starting to appear, and people were writing him letters telling him that they had adopted the names of his characters and they were getting married in ceremonies based on his books. And he was actually very upset by this because he was actually able to detach himself from his own invention. He knew it was an invention.
Sticks with you. You can't sort of shake it off. It takes a grip and that's it. You know, it's with you for pretty much all your life, and I've been into Tolkien for about 20 years.
I describe the world of unmatched depth, and it's a place where everyone can escape his own reality of dark days and rainy days, like so many are met in Britain.
Because one of the things about Tolkien's books is that they are very descriptive. If he talks about a scene, he gives you a lot of information about it. So it's actually quite difficult for an illustrator. You have to work very closely to the text. And unfortunately, a lot of people don't bother. So people like myself and my fiancé tend to prefer Naismith because he does put that bit of extra effort into it.
Among Tolkien's biggest fans are a number of illustrators who've been inspired by his books. Ted Naismith is one of the most admired, and he's even been moved to song.
A lord of wisdom, throned he sat, swift in anger, quick to laugh, an old man in a battered hat, who leaned upon a thorny staff.
There is something of I think, a community, and I have met a number of the other Tolkien illustrators. Some people go for a more quasi-medieval style of painting, and there are those like me who want to get into very serious realism. We all have our disagreements about interpretation because there is wide scope for that, and ultimately the audience for the work, they're the real arbiters of whether you're getting it right or whether it's worth doing it at all.
And he's obviously one of the best Tolkien illustrators in the business, so...
The only one?
Well, just basically, yes. So, as far as we're concerned, anyway, he's the only one who's accurate enough.
I think it's about Tolkien, he's so descriptive, which is why it's so good to illustrate with, because his descriptions of landscapes, you have such a good mental image of it, what exactly that there is. So probably Ted just shuts his eyes and there's a landscape.
It's an interesting dilemma, I guess, because The Lord of the Rings is so beloved that how much responsibility do you have to make the film that fans are wanting to see? And I have to, hope and assume that there's other people that share my sensibility. But you really cannot make a film for fans, for readers. You sort of, it just would become homogenized and diluted.
It's a huge uphill struggle to make that. And I know, as someone who's tried to do it, I have the greatest admiration and sympathy for Peter Jackson. It's glorious in that, that's what movies should be about, making these huge risks and making something as wild and unfilmable and impossible as Lord of the Rings.
We haven't had any communication or contact with the Tolkien family, and they're in no way involved with the movie, which I think is a healthy thing in a way. It's a very much a catch-22 that if the Tolkien family were involved in any way, then the film would be seen as the official adaptation.
It's one of the biggest gambles in film history, to make these three pictures, because if the first one doesn't work, the other two are going to be sitting on the shelf there.
Everything has changed, and yet we've tried to be as faithful as we can. And I know that seems like a very strange thing to say, but sometimes even when you hear a familiar line of dialogue that you remember from the book, it may not even be the same character saying it. Sometimes, Aragorn might be saying a line of Tolkien's dialogue, but it might be a line that Elrond said in the book. I mean, we've just made so many changes whilst trying to basically keep the spirit of the books.
Boromir, it is a strange fate that we should suffer so much fear and doubt over so small a thing.
There's obviously been a huge influence of The Lord of the Rings on other books of the kind. I mean, there were imitators from the beginning, and none of them has come up, to my mind, to Tolkien's level nearly, with the exception of Terry Pratchett, who is just approaching the whole thing with a different attitude, with an attitude of humour rather than religion and mysticism.
Terry Pratchett's fantasy universe owes much to Tolkien, as do the creatures within it, such as the dwarves. For example, Cheery Littlebottom, who adopts a decidedly post-feminist attitude.
Then Cheery Littlebottom had arrived in the city of Ankh-Morpork and had seen that there were men out there who did not wear chainmail or leather underwear, or at least of the sort she normally wore, but did wear interesting colours and exciting makeup, and these men were called women. And in the little bullet head the thought had arisen, why not me? And now she was being denounced in cellars and dwarf bars across the city as the first dwarf in Ankh-Morpork to wear a skirt. It was hard-wearing brown leather and as objectively erotic as a piece of wood, but, as some older dwarves would point out, somewhere under there were his knees. Cheery was only the frothy bit on the tip of the wave. Some younger dwarves were shyly wearing eyeshadow and declaring that, as a matter of fact, they didn't like beer. A current was running through dwarf society. I write the kind of fantasy which I think can be written now. He wrote the kind of fantasy which was appropriate in the middle of the last century.
Dwarves are a race apart. Of their strange beginning, and why they are both like and unlike elves and men, the Silmarillion tells. They are a tough, thrawn race for the most part, secretive, laborious, retentive of the memory of injuries and of benefits, lovers of stone, of gems, of things that shape under the hands of craftsmen rather than things that live by their own life. But they are not evil by nature, and few ever serve the enemy of free will.
It's slow. At times it's absolutely ponderous. There seem to be an awful lot of lists. There appear to be an awful lot of rather more adjectives than are really necessary. And yet it all works.
Tolkien was writing initially for the same audience as The Hobbit, which meant children, and so the beginning of the book is quite childlike. It opens with Bilbo Baggins' birthday party and all kinds of magic tricks and people vanishing and so on. By the time you've got to the end, it's epic, it's biblical. In fact, I can't really stomach the prose in the last of the 3 volumes because it was originally published in 3 volumes. It's got so sort of heavy and then thou art this and that and so on and so on.
The captains bowed their heads, and when they looked up again, behold, their enemies were flying, and the power of Mordor was scattering like dust in the wind. As when death smites the swollen brooding thing that inhabits their crawling hill and holds them all in sway, ants will wander witless and purposeless and then feebly die. So the creatures of Sauron, orc or troll or best spell enslaved, ran hither and thither mindless, and some slew themselves or cast themselves in pits or fled wailing back to hide in holes and dark lightless places far from hope.
He's writing at this point for himself and for an audience that didn't really yet exist, the audience which has become the Tolkien fans, people who want this kind of grand, epic style. To me, the book is at its best when it's much more like John Buchan's 39 Steps, the early part, when they're being pursued by the Black Riders, and it's, you know, basically kind of good and evil on quite a simple level.
"Fly!" he called. "Fly! The enemy is upon us!" The white horse leaped forward. The hobbits ran down the slope. Glorfindel and Strider followed as rearguard. They were only halfway across the flat when suddenly there was a noise of horses galloping. Out of the gate in the trees they had just left rode a Black Rider. He reined his horse in and halted, swaying in his saddle. Another followed him, and then another, then again 2 more. "Ride forward, ride!" cried Glorfindel to Frodo.
I think I probably read Lord of the Rings 6 times. I think that if you don't believe that Tolkien is the greatest writer there ever was when you're 13 years old, there is something wrong with you. If you still think that when you're 53, there's really something wrong with you.
It's one of those books which does divide critical opinion absolutely hugely, and I'm sort of across the divide now. I loved it as a child, I loved it as an adolescent. I then got to the point when I couldn't read it, and I think I couldn't sit down and read it. I would find it too self-contained, too absorbed, not enough about people as they really are. The characters in the end are 2-dimensional. That's a little unfair maybe, but they are cartoon characters really. They are representations of good and evil, of bravery. They're personifications, which you find in the medieval romances, which were one of Tolkien's models and sources, but somehow the crudeness is part of the development of literature. And by the 1950s, this is an age where, we've had Ulysses, we've had Virginia Woolf, and you want to say to Tolkien sometimes, oh, grow up.
The book changed the lives of so many people and endures. It's still always getting voted, the best book of the century, best author of the century, one of the best books of the millennium. And the critics really hate that because they have no control. People just persist in liking what they like.